With Washington Commanders training camp underway, who's overperforming, who's underperforming, and what's the latest on Terry McLaurin's looming contract extension? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Raise Hail Report. I'm your host, Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by the Washington Commanders reporter for the Washington Times, Liam Griffin. Liam, it's great to have you on.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Absolutely, and getting right into it, I think one of the standouts at camp over the past few days has been fourth round wide receiver Jayden Lane. I know he obviously made the catch of the day yesterday over two defensive backs, perfectly placed ball by Jayden Daniels. What has Lane shown you recently, not just as a punt returner, because I know we knew he could thrive in the return game, and that's going to be where he's utilized a lot this season. So not just there, but also as a receiver, what has he shown you over the past few days?
Well, what you saw from that highlight is something that some people were a little bit worried in his ability to do coming out, which is high pointing the football. At 5'10", it's very easy to kind of typecast him as this, all right, he's a shifty slot guy. He's going to return kicks. Maybe he'll get used on some gadget plays. But by doing that, and he's done similar kind of great catches, able to high point the ball, able to catch away from his body. We've seen him flash that abilities a few times throughout camp. And it seems like he's got really sure hands. Like it's not uncommon to see guys like, Luke McCaffrey's had a few drops here and there. That's to be expected. It's camp. But this rookie has been really steady. And you see all the things. Like obviously they're not tackling yet. Today was the first day in pads, but you're seeing that footwork. You're seeing that shiftiness. You're seeing that aggression at the catch point that you really love to see.
And then Washington's secondary, I would say, is one of their biggest concerns going into 2025, especially the safety room. I think there's a lack of star power there. There's a lack of depth there. There's been a lot of questions on just whether they will be able to perform at a high level this season. How has the secondary looked? Who has stepped out to you the most so far? Throughout that secondary, I know you might mention Mike Sainristil. He's been amazing recently, but are there any other guys who have really, outperformed what you were expecting?
Yeah, so I'll start with Mikey Sainristil because I don't think you can have a conversation about Washington's secondary without him. You were saying that Jayden Lane catch was a catch training camp. About 10 minutes before that, Mikey Sainristil did his Odell Beckham Jr. impression, a contested catch. It was obviously Jayden Daniels going, all right, it's practice. I'm going to heave it up. But his ability to grab that ball, hold on to it, and he'll be the first to tell you that Jayden Lane was out of bounds on that catch. Yeah. And there's no doubt about it for Sainristil's interception. So he's someone that every marker that you would want him to hit, you're seeing, and you're thinking, all right, how's he going to slot into this defense? Or he's going to be able to move back into his natural slot cornerback role, playing the nickel with Trey Amos probably on the outside, along with Marshawn Lattimore. But moving to Trey Amos, he's someone who is looking like a steal in the second round. He has immediately taken first team reps. He doesn't look confused. He looks totally comfortable. He is constantly hand fighting with receivers. He's not getting blown off the ball. It's very rare that you see him really lagging behind in coverage. And again, everything that you want to see from a second round cornerback, he's hitting all of those. But at the safety position, I think you're absolutely right. That's something that they kind of didn't address as much in the offseason. Jeremy Chin leaves and you bring in Will Harris, who is a very versatile kind of chess piece for them. He's someone who, he recorded snaps at edge last season. He'll come into the slot cornerback. He'll come in as a linebacker. He'll play that box safety role. But how is that going to translate to being an every down starter? We're just not sure yet. And someone that they've really been trying to work into the first team reps more, which I've been really excited to see, is Tyler Owens, who was an undrafted rookie last year, kind of a surprise to make the 53-man roster as a kind of special teams ace. But he's someone who really impressed everyone throughout training camp last year. And this is something throughout minicamp, throughout OTAs, you've been kind of seeing him run with the first team more. And it's all right, well, how's that going to translate? Today, it translated to him just absolutely exploding into the hole in a run gap. And it was probably the biggest collision of the day with Ja'Cory Croskey-Merritt. Just, you heard that from the sidelines, just the pads hitting, getting everybody used to training camp. And he's also been present in some offensive highlights as well. The very first pass of training camp, Jayden Daniels drops a dime to Deebo Samuel in the end zone. It goes right over Tyler Owens' shoulder. And there's two things there. One, he was in perfect coverage. He was going super step with Deebo. He's exactly where you wanted to be.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he doesn't have that kind of comfort in man coverage to get his head around and play the ball yet. So he's someone that you're going to want to watch because I think he might end up seeing more and more playing time on defense because he is so explosive getting to the ball. And this is a team that wants to be more aggressive. Like defense coordinator Joe Witt Jr. is always talking about the ball is life. Like we want to force more turnovers. And that was not really the case last year. And so Tyler Owens is the guy who, if he can find a way to, clean up those little things, like, all right, work on his footwork in the slot to kind of keep up with those shiftier guys like Jaylen Lane. If he's able to, have the ball skills to get his head around to, contest that catch by Deebo Samuel, he's someone that I think could find his way into the starting lineup.
And then staying on the defensive side, looking at the line, the Commanders allowed the third most rushing yards of any team throughout the league last season. You lose both Jonathan Allen and Dante Fowler in free agency. You do add some guys, right? You add Kinlaw to obviously be your tackle. Then you add Weiss on the edge. But now that you have pads on, they came on today. I think that gives you a much better look at both offensive line and defensive line. What has really stood out to you about this defensive line? Do you see the run defense maybe continuing to be a problem this year?
I think it would be hard for them to be too much worse is the good news. And when you talk about Dante Fowler signing in free agency somewhere else, that might be a little bit of, he's a great pass rusher, but it might be a little bit of addition by subtraction because he was a real liability stealing the edge for that defense. And when we talk about defensive line play and stopping the run, like obviously a lot of that attention is going to go to the interior. But when you're playing an explosive back like Saquon Barkley, it's really vital for those defensive ends and those outside linebackers to seal that edge to keep things from breaking outside, especially when you have Bobby Wagner is an incredible linebacker, first ballot Hall of Famer, easy all-pro every year in my mind. He's not exactly like sprinting sideline to sideline the way he maybe was 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think that you're going to see a bit of an upgrade on that edge position by moving in Dietrich Wise. And I also think that someone that I've been really kind of paying more attention to, looking for, is Javonte Jean-Baptiste. He's someone who was a seventh-round rookie last year. He got a little bit of playing time, and I think he had some injuries that kind of derailed his rookie season. But with that gap on the edge, they're going to be filling that role by committee, it seems like. You're seeing a lot of Frankie Louvu coming in as a pass rusher, playing on-ball linebacker. You're seeing Dorrance Armstrong as like that every down presence. And then on the interior, they've got a little bit of a traffic jam because they saw that as a position of need, and they really sent a lot of resources into that. So you already mentioned Javon Kinlaw. That was obviously the biggest contract of free agency for them. They brought in a guy like Eddie Goldman, and then you already have Deron Payne and Johnny Newton there. And so, all right, that's 4 solid interior defensive linemen who are going to be big bodies to clog the lane. It was the first day of practice, and also the Commanders' backs are having a really strong camp. Croskey-Merritt is someone who has been really explosive in his way to make a cut and get up the field. But I think Dan Quinn's going to want to see a little bit more of them as the season approaches.
And it feels like Washington has kind of aced their, 7th-round picks recently. I know the ace is a strong word, but it feels like they've at least drafted guys who have shown potential to be in this, starting lineup and really contribute to this team, which is something you don't always see from a 7th-round pick. And you mentioned Croskey-Merritt. He was their 7th-rounder this year. Both Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler are in contract years. Right, you got an aging Jeremy McNichols who's about to turn 30. Is it fair to say that Croskey-Merritt could be the starter by the end of the season, potentially even sooner, depending on what we see from him going forward?
I would be a little bit surprised if he's the full starter by the end of the season, just because, starting running back in particular for an offense like this is such a weird role anyway, because it's going to depend on, what kind of situations they're facing, whether they're bringing Austin Eckler or Brian Robinson Jr. But I think he's someone who, like, if you're telling me to, place a bet, which I won't because I won't, but to place a bet on, what commander is going to have the most rushing yards in December, I think Croskey-Merritt might be a smart move there because they are really high on him. And it's pretty unanimous that the league viewed him similarly. He's someone that dropped in the draft just because of, off-field eligibility issues. And that's not even something that people think was like a character concern for him. Like that was out of his control, really. And so I think that he may not be, the starting running back by the end of the year. He might not lead the team in rushing yards. But I think that when we get to December, January, February, the team and the fans and, us talking heads on the sideline might be like, okay, you might feel more comfortable letting guys like Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler walk. But similar to that interior defensive line, there's a lot of like capable players who are going to be fighting for a few roster spots. You mentioned Jeremy McNichols, who had a lot of run last year as someone who can also contribute on special teams. Chris Rodriguez is someone who is like a routine fan favorite for like dominating the preseason and kind of showing flashes late in games, but he hasn't really been able to translate that to a full, established role in the lineup. So that's 5 guys we just mentioned. It seems unlikely that we're going to keep all of them on the roster. It seems like, McNichols and Rodriguez would probably be the 2 men out there, but this is a chance for Ja'Cory Croskey-Merritt to really like establish his presence and start to really find a role within the offense.
And then speaking of fan favorite players, you also have undrafted free agent Ja'Cory Brooks. And I know there's been a lot of talk surrounding him recently, especially in that first week, but are there any other UDFAs that have really stood out to you so far?
I definitely think Ja'Cory Brooks, in the same position, Jacoby Jones is someone who I understand why he got brought on. I think he's someone that could impress as camp goes on and throughout the preseason. But that wide receiver position in general is really strange for them because, you've had Chris Moore, who's a journeyman, who's been bouncing around the league for almost 10 years now, who, all right, Terry McLaurin's not at camp. Chris Moore, get out there and is taking first team snaps. But yeah, no, I think those are the 2 that are really sticking out. Those 2 receivers as undrafted free agents are the guys. And then on the offensive line, McKay from NC State is someone who is on the physically unable to perform list. I'm really high on him. We haven't seen him practice yet, obviously, due to the injury. But I think that's someone who is just a really intelligent stash for them as someone who could compete for a spot on the roster, active roster, this time next year.
And you look at McKay and he was a guy who before that injury at the pro day, he was probably going to be a 4th or 5th, 6th round pick. So it recently has seemed like Washington is not scared to take guys with an injury risk and really bet on getting a deal with them later in the draft. And you kind of see that there with McKay as well. Now, the last question I have about training camp before we get into some Terry McLaurin talk, there's been a lot of conversation recently surrounding Jayden Daniels and sophomore slump and comparing him to CJ Stroud and what are our expectations for him this year? He's looked really solid. He's looked really solid out there. He's added a lot of muscle compared to last season. I don't see any sophomore slump stuff going on. Texans had the worst offensive line in the league last season. CJ's top 3 wide receivers missed a combined 17 games. And you see Washington, they address the offensive line. They add Debo, but not really about that sophomore slump. I just want to ask you, what are some of your main takeaways from his training camp so far? Because I would say he's arguably looked better than where he was at last season, not just at training camp, but also during the regular season when he was really looking extremely solid out there.
Yeah, there's really nothing more that you could ask for from Jayden Daniels. It seems like every practice he's coming in, he's someone who has attacked the offseason in a real effective way. He came in with goals. He was like, all right, I want to put on a little bit of muscle. He thinks it's really funny that everyone is so flabbergasted by it. But he was like, yeah, people were concerned about, my injury risk. And there was a little bit of that. He had that rib injury from a run where he got tackled awkwardly. And I think he wants to avoid that because the best ability is availability. But every time, every practice, he's making a throw that you couldn't do that better if you were handing it to somebody from 5 feet away. Like you couldn't place it any better. And then we also know that he is obsessive, like in the film room, with his virtual reality training. He is really dedicated to these kinds of things. But when we compare it to the Texans, I think you hit the nail on the head. Those issues, that sophomore slump of CJ Stroud, when you look at some of that advanced analytics, wasn't really on CJ Stroud. Like that offensive line was obviously a mess and got worse this year because the Commanders have their best offensive lineman now in Larry Tunsil. Yeah. all those issues with the pass catchers, which, another one, Noah Brown is over here too. So CJ Stroud was really fighting an uphill battle, and in that play calling, and Bobby Slowick's offense was just not able to adapt in a way that you need to as an NFL offense. And that's the only knock that I could possibly see when you're looking at, all right, maybe the second year won't be as good as the first, is how are opposing defenses adjusting to Cliff Kingsbury's offense? What is he bringing to the table that's going to be new this season to kind of prevent teams adjusting to him? Because that's something that you saw in Arizona a lot. He kind of dispelled some of those myths last year with the continued strong performances throughout the year. But you saw hot starts of hit for his offenses in Arizona that cooled off down the stretch as defenses adjusted. How is he going to avoid that in his play calling and his scheming? How is he going to involve guys like Deebo Samuel? If this Terry McLaurin holdout continues through the start of the season, how are you going to adjust to that? And so that's what I really think would be the only area is, well, the schedule is much tougher this year. There's not a lot of like cupcakes, Panthers, Browns matchups waiting for them. And how do opposing defenses react to Jayden Daniels now? They have a full year of film plus a postseason and plenty of time to go over it. So personally, I don't see any logical reason to predict a Jayden Daniels slump. I've been saying it, but I think like the most likely outcome maybe is, all right, maybe the team's record is a little bit worse, but that's because they they regress to the mean in terms of like some of those end of game situations where it just seemed like so many of them went Washington's way. But it could be a situation where the record is a little bit worse. The team is like unanimously better off and stronger heading into the postseason because of the adjustments they made.
And even when you look at the record, yes, CJ Stroud had a worse season, but the Texans actually won one more game than they did in his rookie season, which is something I don't think people totally realized. And then also, if you're watching this, make sure you like and subscribe. It's completely free, helps out the channel a ton. But, moving to Terry McLaurin, right? Yesterday, he showed up to training camp for the first time, no longer a holdout. Now it's a hold in. He was placed on the PUP list with an ankle injury. Nothing that we didn't already know. But, I want to get into what Schefter said on the Pat McAfee show earlier today, which I'm sure you saw. But, before we get into that, just, first off, why did he show up to camp in the first place? Do you think it was to avoid fines? He was missing for 3 days. He accumulated $150,000 in fines, right? Was it to avoid fines, just be around the organization, interact with fans, maybe even add more pressure to Washington? Why did he show up?
Oh, it's a combination of those things. For one, you're negotiating for more money. Those total fines add up real quick. So there was the 3 days of actual training camp practices, plus failing to report for the opening physical and conditioning test added another $50,000. So it's $200,000 from training camp plus $105,000 that he missed from mandatory minicamp. People talk a lot about these guys are millionaires. Anytime that you have to pay $300,000 in fines, it does not matter how much money you make. That doesn't feel good.
And I mean, at some point, that also takes away from the contract that he's hoping to get. Like if that kept going, he already loses $1 million of what he's hoping to receive.
Yeah, holding out throughout the entire training camp. I think there's, I'd be guessing because I don't have the schedule in front of me, but something like 16 training camp practices. Like that would be it would be untenable for, and those mandatory minicamp fines can be waived by the team for certain reasons. The training camp fines per the CBA cannot be waived. So like, even if, he and the team get on great terms and they get the perfect deal, he's going to have to pay those fines no matter what. So yeah, I definitely think that's going to be, that's a financial decision in one way. And also it allows him to control the narrative a little bit more, where he's not practicing, but he appeared after practice yesterday. He appeared after practice today, very conspicuously speaking to his agent on the field after both of those instances. And also signing autographs for fans for probably between the 2 days, close to 45 minutes, just like, sitting and individually greeting every single fan. He's hearing all the fans, telling the team to pay him. And I think that the organization is hearing all those fans as well. But this is not an impulsive group. This is not the ownership group of the past either. They're not going to just like run into a contract that they're not comfortable with because of public pressure like that. But it is something where he feels undervalued. And so he is trying to get back on the field, in this case, not practicing, but at least in front of the fans, to kind of show the team like, hey, look at all these people who are here wearing my jersey, who are clamoring to meet me, who are, lining up. Like, I have a value to this franchise. And he also wants to be in the building. He wants to be in the building to, continue building those relationships with his teammates, to study film, to maybe get some of that, athletic trainer help. But he says he does not want to be a distraction, which I understand, because he's not a flashy guy. He's someone who wants to go about and do his business, and he'll talk to the media for 45 minutes straight if he wants to, because he's got a lot to say and he understands our jobs too. But he doesn't want to create a distraction if it can be avoided. But right now it really can't be. So he at least wants to be there to talk to his teammates, I feel like, to be like, hey, sorry that everyone's going to be asking you Terry McLaurin questions. Yeah. And they all seem to understand it too. Like every single player in that building has had to negotiate a contract. Some of those negotiations have gone better than others, but I think everybody understands that. And so it's a combination of all the things you mentioned. It's getting back in the building with his teammates. It's, getting that kind of approval from the fans, and it's avoiding those hefty fines.
And as Jayden said the other day, it's part of the business, right? So I think that just goes into players kind of understanding where he's at. And then earlier today on the Pat McAfee show, Adam Schefter stated that McLaurin wants, quote, considerably more than DK Metcalf, who is currently making an annual salary of $33 million. I know Commanders Twitter got really angry over that. I know a lot of people who were on Terry's side are maybe starting to doubt whether he really deserves that, because considerably more than what DK is making would likely put him as the third highest wide receiver, paid wide receiver in the NFL, above CeeDee Lamb. So, right, is that reasonable to you? Is that unreasonable? How if that's true, maybe it's part of, the agent, which we'll get into later. But if it's really coming from Terry McLaurin, how big of a holdup is that in these negotiations?
I think that's huge, because you look at the other receivers who are on that list. Terry is not in the same stage of his career as guys. This is his third contract. He had the rookie deal. He had a deal he signed in 2022. This is the third deal. He turns 30, I think, between week 1 and week 2, or week 2 and week 3, one of those. This is his age 30 season. He is very vocal in talking about his track record. He's like, I don't miss games. I'm healthy. Ironically, he's on the physically unable to perform list right now, for, ankle injuries. But he's someone who's like, I don't miss games. I'm here. I'm, face of the franchise. But $33 million is a lot of money, and he is not a young player. And so I don't think it's fair to compare him to someone like Garrett Wilson or somebody like DK Metcalf, because he also hasn't always had that same kind of explosive production. Obviously, the quarterback situation throughout his whole tenure here has been an issue, but I don't think anyone is saying that he's Jamar Chase, or that he's CeeDee Lamb, as someone who's going to completely dominate your offense. You're going to game plan around him. And so I think selling on significantly more than $33 million is going to be a really tough sell for this organization that loves Terry, and they want him on the field, and they want to be a part of this team for the long haul. But at the same time, they do not want to be hamstrung by a contract for an aging receiver, because those contracts often don't pan out well. Like, it is more the exception than the rule when signing a receiver over 30 is able to maintain their production into that latter half of their career. The recent examples are, innumerable when you look at guys like AJ Brown or Julio Jones AJ Green, not AJ Brown. Absolutely not. But Antonio Brown, like, those contracts don't always hold up super well. And when receivers start to plummet, it can hit like a brick wall. And so I think that's what the team's worried about. And so there's considerably more than $33 million is going to be really hard to sell. And as somebody in the chat just mentioned, like, Courtland Sutton is the same age, not the same caliber of player, but, I think that's going to adjust the kind of, market for Terry. The, team's going to look at that and say, that's what Courtland Sutton is signing for, come back to reality a little bit.
And I don't think the Courtland deal helps at all, because obviously there's a big gap, right? They're not comparable, as you mentioned, but they're both 29, about to turn 30. McLaurin turns 30 in September, Sutton in October. So this is the one guy who's recently got some time that we can really compare just based off age, and the Sutton just got at least 10 million less than what it seems as though McLaurin wants. Now, you talked about this earlier. He was signing autographs for, maybe 45 minutes, right? And a lot of the guys who hold out request a trade. And McLaurin never did that when he was holding out. And I think a big part of that is because he wants to stay in Washington. He likes it here if it's possible for him to stay, right? But have you gotten the sense that, Washington wants to keep him as well? Or have you gotten the sense that maybe they're okay with losing him if the contracts get too high?
In terms of the trade, my sense is that it would be more likely and he doesn't want to do this, and he's been very vocal about this, but he said it, I guess, 2 weeks ago now when we were talking to him at Eastern Motors commercial, that he doesn't want to request a trade, but it takes two to tango. Like, something's going to have to give. And so I think he would be more likely to request a trade before the team. But I think the team would rather, have him play through his contract this season, maybe, try to negotiate again next offseason, or potentially a franchise tag. I think they would rather go down that route than to sign him to a contract that they're not comfortable with, that they feel like might, impact their ability to make deals in the future. Because it's wild to think, but this team is like entering a championship window. And I don't think they take that lightly when you look at the moves that they've made and the trades that they've made and the draft capital that they've given up. I think that they are going to try to maximize this time as much as possible. And Terry's in a kind of tough position because of like the stage of his career that he's in by, being drafted in 2019. Like, he's a few years ahead of where Jayden is. In an ideal world, you want to be on that Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase timeline. It just didn't work out like that. But I think the team would rather, try to leave on friendly terms or, try to negotiate a deal next offseason than to just fully capitulate and give him, a ginormous deal right now.
Now, last question before we wrap things up. Buddy Baker is McLaurin's agent. And when you look at Baker's client list, McLaurin is by far the biggest name. So, when Schefter broke that news earlier, how much of that do you think had to do with Baker and the fact that he knows McLaurin is his biggest client and that he's going to get him the most amount of money? Do you think he's kind of pushing for more than what McLaurin actually deserves?
Obviously, there's a lot of gamesmanship at play in any contract negotiation, especially in the things that come to us like as members of the media. It's like a game of telephone, and like, all right, someone is doing a calculation of how is putting this information out going to benefit my negotiations, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's how the business operates. But from the things that I have heard, it seems like Terry understands his worth and he has a number in mind, and he wants to feel valued like that.
Yep.
Like, I haven't gotten that sense at all. Obviously, I don't, Terry and his agent have had conversations on the field the last 2 days that we are not privy to, but I don't get the sense that there's demand coming from the agent, because this is a really delicate situation for them. And the Commanders hold a lot of the leverage in an instance like this. Like, he's under contract for this year. He's not going to hold out through the whole year. And if he requests a trade, is that burning goodwill? How much does that impact maybe future contract negotiations? If he gets traded somewhere else and maybe doesn't fit in that system immediately or doesn't have the same kind of production, like that's a very delicate situation. I don't think that an agent would be, willing to sacrifice that just to get his own payday. But, Terry wants to get paid, and I don't think anyone can blame him for that, trying to secure your future for as long as possible. But I think that fans are aware of the situation and they see the clock ticking towards September. And I think something's got to give.
Absolutely. And, I can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up?
No, subscribe to your local newspaper. That'd be cool. But other than that, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Check out Liam's work at the Washington Times. If you made it up to this point, I can't thank you enough for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe, completely free, and helps the channel grow significantly. Again, I'm Matthew Heiserman on the Raise Hail Report alongside Liam Griffin. And as always, we will see you next time.